The subcommittee will come to order. Burma, also known as Myanmar, is a country with a long history and a rich culture that has, after decades of military rule, in recent years taken the first steps to transition into a disciplined democracy. In 2011, the Burmese military regime dissolved the ruling junta and handed power over to the Union Parliament and then President Thein Sein, reserving considerable influence for themselves. On November 8th, Burma is scheduled to hold its first openly contested election in 25 years, with hopes that it will be credible, transparent, and inclusive. As the elections draw near, we watch intently to see if Burma lives up to its promises. Committee staff has traveled to Burma to observe political dynamics and assess the humanitarian situation in the lead-up to this election. And I find that I'm both optimistic and pessimistic. The ultimate success of political transition remains uncertain. How should we in Congress judge a systematically manipulated democratic transition in light of what may be a credible, transparent, and inclusive election process on November 8th? If the odds are intentionally in the ruling party's favor, but they have a clean election, how should the U.S. respond? We know that the election is not the end-all, be-all for Burma. We will watch the political transition unfold in the coming months to look for a peaceful transition and sustained dedication to transparency, openness, and reform. We welcome a sustained transition to democracy, while it's yet to be seen. And in the meantime, we'll urge restraint on further expansion of U.S.-Burma relations. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished panels what we should expect from the election and the ensuing transition, and what it means for the people of Burma. There are other major issues to discuss here today. On October 15th, the government, the military, and 8 ethnic armed organizations signed a joint ceasefire agreement after 2 years of negotiations. About a dozen armed ethnic groups declined to sign. I'll wait to see how the remaining ethnic armed groups will be reintegrated into the process, but how the post-ceasefire political dialogue will take shape, and how Burma intends to address the humanitarian costs and challenges the conflict has wreaked on their country. Speaking of uncertain futures, I'm saddened by the resolute denial of rights to the Rohingya people. After the 2012 riots that displaced nearly 150,000 Rakhine and Rohingya, there are little improvement in living standards. Our staff recently visited Rakhine to investigate the conditions and look at the displaced camps, where over 143,000 people still live. At the Rakhine camps, residents asked the United States to provide solar power, jobs, and funding for education. And this is what the homes look like. You can see them on your screens or on the screens on the walls. At the Rohingya camps, homes were literally sinking into rice paddies that the houses have been built on. If you see here, the disparity is quite stark. The Rohingyas' asks weren't about the amenities, what amenities were missing. They want to be able to feed and provide for their families and for their children. As the monsoon season recedes, we may see another repeat of earlier this year, tens of thousands of migrants boarding rickety boats to aimlessly tackle the seas in search of hope in Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. The United States alone cannot be the solution to this problem. The Burmese government must address this heinous violation of human rights. I do want to recognize the Burmese government for making commendable advances in its economy, its political system, and civil society. The aperture is widened for greater freedoms and voices to be heard, but not sufficiently. It's also clear how much hard work remains to be done. Members present are going to be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. And without objection, the hearing record will be open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record subject to the length of limitation in the rules. And I recognize Mr. Royce.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Salmon. Thank you for, by the way, traveling to Rakhine State in order to view this firsthand and also for this hearing. Many are looking at Burma's upcoming elections to gauge the progress in that troubled country, and a better yardstick, in my view, is the country's abhorrent treatment of the minority Rohingya Muslims, probably the most persecuted minority group in the world. That should be our test of the key test. The elections are important, but this is even more important. It is the yardstick. For over 3 decades now, the government of Burma has systematically denied the Rohingya even the most basic of human rights. A 1982 citizenship law denies the Rohingya Burmese citizenship, even though most of them have lived in the country for generations. This goes back to the 8th century, their presence there, by the way. In the past 5 years, since the Obama administration's outreach to the Burmese regime, 140,000 Rohingyas and other Muslims have been displaced by violence, and hundreds have been killed. As one 12-year-old Rohingya boy recounted during the 2012 violence, Burmese men broke into his house and beat his father's head in with a brick before slaughtering him with a knife. For the mass killings that broke out in 2012, exceptionally few have been prosecuted, let alone jailed. In fact, a non-governmental organization based in Southeast Asia disclosed credible documents detailing state involvement in persecuting Rohingyas. They outlined state policies on population control, restrictions on movement, that empower security forces to use abusive measures to control Rohingya, among other steps. Now, it is no wonder that Rohingyas by the thousands, as Chairman Salmon just mentioned, are packing themselves into boats to flee, and they're fleeing for their lives. They end up in Malaysia and Bangladesh, facing the hardships of destitute refugees, and others perish in the Indian Ocean or fall prey to human traffickers. There must be a way to protect these individuals through a safe zone in the Rakhine State. There must be a way to have humanitarian groups have the ability to go in there and work with this community and have people protected in that state, and other minorities protected in that state. This tragedy is what happens when a government refuses to recognize its own people. And the Than Sayan government maintains that Rohingyas are merely Bengali migrant workers. But their roots go back centuries. Muslims trace their roots back to Rakhine State to the 8th century. These deep historic ties of the Rohingya to Burma must be recognized and, of course, protected. The government of Burma cannot claim progress towards meeting its reform goals if it so blatantly and cruelly mistreats Rohingya Muslims and other minority groups. The U.S. must prioritize the protection of human rights in its relations with Burma, using the tools we have at our disposal. In August, Ranking Member Engel and I wrote to the Treasury Department expressing our concern that only one individual had been added to the specially designated nationals list for violations of human rights since violence erupted back in 2012. That is the list for enforcing economic sanctions, blocking assets, and trade to accomplish our foreign policy goals. With a people on the verge of genocide, it's inexcusable that we are not aggressively targeting abusers here. We need to do that. More than one needs to be on that list. And I plan on working with the administration, providing additional names of Burmese human rights abusers to be added to the specially designated national list. And again, I thank Chairman Salmon, and I thank Mr. Sherman, and I look forward to hearing from the administration on this. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding these hearings about Burma or Myanmar. I want to focus on 3 things: the Rohingya, the elections, and U.S. policy. I want to associate myself with the last 2 opening statements. The Rohingya constitute 1.1 million people, 2% of Burma's population. The persecution has been well described by the last two speakers. They've lived in, just recently in temporary camps for 3 years. Of course, they faced discrimination long since then. We advocate democracy around the world, but we should make it clear we advocate democracy with minority rights around the world. And as Burma heads into the elections in November, it appears that both the ruling party, the USDP, and the main opposition party, the NLD, are avoiding proposing solutions for the plight of the Rohingya. This is particularly disappointing when it comes to Aung Suu Kyi and her party. She has captured the imagination of human rights advocates around the world for decades. But now her voice is silent when we see the oppression of 2% of Burma's population. Of course, the ruling party is worse, having passed 4 race and religion protection laws. Now, one issue here is the concept of citizenship. We have birthright citizenship here in the United States. It's controversial. Other countries have different rules. But what we can't see is a circumstance where people who have lived in a country for multiple generations are denied rights. We need to be able to define the difference between reasonable immigration law enforcement, which does involve deportations in some circumstances, with ethnic cleansing of people who have been there for generations. And I hope the State Department can tell me that we have a line that guides the State Department on what is the appropriate treatment of minority groups who have been in a place for generations and yet are not accorded the benefits of full citizenship. I've been briefed by the ambassador twice and the foreign minister once on these issues just in the last few weeks. And as I understand it, people, even if they did arrive before World War II, are not citizens. Their children are not citizens, but their grandchildren may be citizens if they can show papers that their grandparents arrived decades and decades ago. This is an absurd system, especially when I'm not sure that it was the chief objective of the Japanese occupying forces to issue citizenship or residency papers to those crossing what had been a border between two British controlled areas in South Asia. The State Department, moving on to the election, the State Department had different definitions for what would be a successful election, unlike the 2010 and 2012 elections where the standard was free and fair. For the November elections, we are calling for elections to be transparent, inclusive, and credible. I don't know whether this is a raising of the bar or a lowering of the bar. It's been said that it involves a lowering of the bar. And we have to look at not only the Rohingya, but some 600 villages where people are not going to be allowed to participate in the election. We have to look at the voter list prepared in part at our expense, yet containing many made-up names on the one hand and excluding many people who would likely vote for the opposition. As to what we can do, Burmese officials are asking us to do 3 things. Sanctions relief, USAID and military financing, and joint military exercises. In picking whether we're willing to do any of these, we have to look at the human rights situation. We should not be so arrogant as to ignore our own economic circumstance and note that sanctions relief would not cost the U.S. government anything, might allow our companies to make some money, probably not. I'd like to see a lot better human rights situation before we talk about that. But USAID, FMF, and even military exercises all come at the cost to the American taxpayer. The Burmese government has made 11 promises. They haven't even started to fulfill some of them. We, of course, have talked about ethnic problems in Rakhine State. There's also the promise to establish a ceasefire in Kachin, and that is also a very unmet promise, with only 8 of the 20 groups who have signed on, and of course the biggest groups have not. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, not only about Burma, but also what standards do we apply to determine whether an election meets our standards, and what standards do we apply to draw the distinction between reasonable immigration laws on the one hand and ethnic cleansing of people who have been in a country for centuries on the other. I yield back.
Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be brief. I had an opportunity to travel to Burma. I guess it's been 4 or 5 years ago, something like that, and it was shortly either before or after then Secretary of State Clinton went there, and have worked very closely in a bipartisan manner with our colleague Joe Crawley on a number of issues related to Burma. And you know, the administration has tried to portray our new relationship and the new Burma as a success story. And I think probably the most positive thing that you can say is that the jury's still out on that. There are still tremendous problems, and some of them have already been mentioned, particularly with respect to the Rohingya. And one of my main criticisms would be that the administration has been too willing to reach out, work with, cooperate with Burmese military with promises of reforms, which we really haven't seen significant evidence that they're actually carrying out with these things. There are still tremendous human rights abuses of the minorities and the militaries involved in these things, particularly with respect to the Rohingya, as I say, has already been mentioned. And just one final point. You know, I don't think that Burma can try to tout to the world that they really have reformed and that they are a true democracy until the most popular political figure in the country, Aung San Suu Kyi, is eligible to lead that country. And I think that's what the people of Burma, the vast majority of the people, would like to see. It hasn't happened yet, but I hope it does sometime in the very near future. And I'll yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the ranking member. Mr. Chairman, I think you put it best when we think about Burma or Myanmar, both cautious optimism, but also some pessimism. And you know, as I think about the next steps in Myanmar's progress, you know, we are looking very closely at the November 8th elections. I mean, there really does have to be a credible, transparent, and inclusive election here. And you know, that's a message that we've shared with the ambassador. That is something that I think many of us here in Congress will be looking for. And again, it's cautious optimism. We want to see that progress. We want to see Myanmar become more of a stable democracy. We want to see some constitutional reforms that make it a much more inclusive constitution that also makes Parliament a much more inclusive body as well. It's going to take time, and I recognize that we won't get where we'd like to see Myanmar overnight, but we do want to see that steady progress. And you know, Myanmar does have an important role as we look to stabilize South Asia, as we look to work in that region to develop economies, to address human rights concerns, et cetera. But again, in no uncertain terms, the next big step is November 8th to make sure that this is a credible election that is somewhat fair. So thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the witnesses for joining us today. Like many on the panel before us today, I want to be optimistic about Burma's future and believe that the current leadership is ready to turn towards democracy and respecting the human rights of its people. But I join with others in being discouraged by the continuing efforts to restrict the openness of the November elections, and most importantly, the ongoing persecution of the Rohingya people. The Union Election Commission's uneven actions and lack of transparency have severely undermined the credibility of this election well in advance of voting. You know, this reminds me of the 2013 parliamentary elections in nearby Cambodia. One of the major protests of the opposition parties after the election was that the supposedly impartial National Election Committee was in fact stacked by the ruling Cambodian People's Party and Prime Minister Hun Sen. I believe the case of Cambodia highlights the need for independent election monitoring, both from domestic civil society and by international observers. Even after the election, the consequences of two constitutional provisions must be reckoned with today. The fact that a quarter of the parliamentary seats are going to be reserved for appointment by the military and not accountable to the people, to the will of the people, raises serious questions about the country's commitment to democracy. I've also raised the issue of opposition leader Aung San Suu Kyi being constitutionally barred from being president. I join with Chairman Solomon and Chairman Royce in being deeply disturbed by the ongoing repression of the Rohingya, a Muslim ethnic minority. For years, the military regime has claimed these people are not citizens, depriving them of their most basic rights. The persecution of the Rohingya has led to a major refugee crisis that has affected Burma, Bangladesh, Thailand, Malaysia, and the entire region. Now the Burmese government is forbidding the Rohingya from participating in the upcoming election. Recently had the chance to meet with a group of parliamentarians from Burma through the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, including U Che Mong, a Rohingya member of parliament. He will not be able to run for election next month because the Election Commission says he's not a citizen. I thank the chairman for holding this important and timely hearing. It's our duty to encourage Burma to continue down the path of opening up and democratizing while we point out the serious and ongoing human rights violations in the country. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Our panel this morning is made up of distinguished witnesses from the administration. First Assistant Secretarial Daniel Russell joins us from the State Department's Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and Assistant Administrator Jonathan Stivers joins us from USAID. We're thrilled to have you here today, and we'll start with you, Mr. Russell.
Well, Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Sherman, members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify on this important issue today and for your longstanding support of U.S. policy in the Asia-Pacific region and vis-a-vis the U.S.-Burma relationship specifically. I'm very pleased to be here today with my colleague John Stivers from USAID to speak about our support for democracy, for peace, and for human rights in Burma. I've been visiting Burma in my previous and current capacity regularly since December of 2011 when I accompanied then Secretary Clinton. And I've seen reform in Burma create space for political debate, for an active civil society, and for greater press freedoms. Burma clearly has come a long way in 4 short years. That said, as the members have pointed out, it obviously has much work to do. The elections on November 8th will be an important milestone for Burma's transition. We want the entire electoral process, from the campaign to polling to vote counts to the formation of the next government and the selection of the next president, to be as credible, as transparent, as inclusive, as free and fair as possible, given the challenges facing a fledgling democracy and given the shortcomings in Burma's current constitution and its system. That's why we've been providing assistance to political parties, civil society, media, the government, and others, as John will describe. And it's made a difference. It's also notable that the Election Commission has welcomed international experts and observers to help advance the quality and the credibility of the upcoming election. But even if the election meets international standards, as of course we all hope it will, Burma's transition to inclusive civilian democracy will be far from complete. As you've pointed out, the disenfranchisement of hundreds of thousands of white cardholders, mostly Rohingyas, undermines universal suffrage. So does the disqualification of Muslim candidates. The seats in parliament reserved for the military and the rules that bar Aung San Suu Kyi from the presidency deeply concern us as well. That said, these structural flaws are not stopping her. They're not stopping the NLD or the 90-plus political parties and the 6,000 candidates who are competing vigorously and, by and large, peacefully for both local and national seats. What's unprecedented about Burma's elections now in 2015 is that no one actually knows who's going to win. And that's a good thing. But while the elections can be a significant step forward for the country, they're only one step. The next government is going to have to accelerate reform, improve governance, heal religious and ethnic divides, including in Rakhine State, advance the peace process, and address the constitutional obstacles to a full civilian democracy. Now, I mentioned the peace process. Like the United States, Burma is a diverse union, and after nearly 70 years of ethnic-based conflict, it knows very well that reconciliation is essential to Burma's national development and its security. So we very much welcome last week's signing of a ceasefire agreement as a first step towards a just and sustainable peace. Not all groups have signed, although they have agreed on the text of the document. And continued military action and a lack of humanitarian access in Kachin and Shan states shows there's still a lot of work to be done. I also want to raise, as you have, human rights. Despite the considerable progress documented in the State Department's annual Human Rights Report, over 100 political prisoners are in detention, while over 400 are facing charges, according to civil society sources. We have criticized the recent arrests of students, activists, and journalists for exercising their democratic rights and freedoms. Most recently, Patrick Kumjali and Chaw Sanditun. Likewise, we've privately and publicly objected to discrimination against religious and ethnic minorities. We're deeply, deeply concerned about the situation in Rakhine State. We are pushing hard for the protection, for opportunity, and ultimately a path to citizenship for the Rohingya, a path that respects their rights, their safety, and their dignity. And we're clear about the danger from measures like the race and religion laws and the rise in religious hate speech. Mr. Chairman, advocating for democracy and human rights is central to our diplomacy in Burma, across the region, and across the globe. President Obama, U.S. diplomats do it. You, as members of Congress, do as well. I admit to being an admirer of the Burmese determination to make a historic transition from decades of military dictatorship, corruption, and civil war to a peaceful union with a civilian-led democratic government, and I believe it's in the best interests of the United States to help them to succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Stivers.
Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Sherman, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to testify today on the role of USAID in advancing U.S. foreign policy goals in Burma. It is an honor to appear again before the committee and a pleasure to be alongside my colleague from the State Department, Danny Russell. The United States has a fundamental interest in the success of Burma's reforms and remains a committed partner to those who seek greater freedom, prosperity, and dignity. Decades of military rule and conflict have prevented the development of well-functioning governance systems and has negatively impacted Burma's economic standing. Today, it is one of the poorest countries in the world, with a quarter of the population living in poverty and significant health challenges, including some of the highest HIV, malaria, and drug-resistant TB rates in the region. Ultimately, Burma's future will be determined by its people, and that is why support for civil society is at the core of our efforts, from strengthening political reforms and furthering national reconciliation to expanding economic opportunity and improving the health and resilience of vulnerable communities. Most recently, democratic freedoms continue to be tested. I associate myself with the concerns of Assistant Secretary Russell in regards to the recent arrests, and one of the arrests was the spouse of a USAID grantee, and they should be released immediately and unconditionally. While the people of Burma face many development challenges, I will focus on the election, the Rohingya, and the peace process. In terms of the election, we knew from the beginning that supporting the mechanics of a democratic election would be a tremendous challenge, but it was a challenge worth accepting because the reformers in Burma asked for and needed our involvement. And despite the challenges, the people of Burma are actively participating in a vibrant and competitive election season with 93 registered political parties, including 60 parties representing ethnic minority groups. The U.S. government is providing more than $18 million in assistance to support the elections and political process. This includes assistance relating to the election administration, election observation, political party building, civil society, and the media. On election administration, we're working through the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES, to increase the capacity of the Union Election Commission. The Union Election Commission has made significant efforts to engage with civil society on election preparations, include ethnic representatives on the commission, improve the technical aspects of election preparations, and support the deployment of independent election observers. In addition, through our partner, the International Republican Institute, IRI, USAID is helping to train political parties on managing effective party offices and ensuring that party policies are representative and inclusive. But despite the positive steps, many Muslim candidates were recently disqualified and hundreds of thousands of Rohingya have been disenfranchised. Steps that limit political participation run counter to democratic principles and raise questions about the inclusivity of the elections. In the treatment of the Rohingya, the United States remains deeply concerned about the humanitarian and human rights situation in Rakhine State and the treatment of minorities, including the ethnic Rohingya population. More than 143,000 internally displaced persons remain in camps with limited access to basic services, restrictions on their movement, and tremendous levels of poverty and malnutrition. The U.S. governments over the past year alone include more than $50 million in assistance, in humanitarian assistance to the vulnerable people, including the Rohingya in Burma and the region. Assistance includes access to safe drinking water, new sanitation facilities, and hygiene promotion activities in these camps. And in response to the recent floods, USAID is providing more than $5 million in flood relief and recovery to the people affected in the disaster, reaching over 250,000 people with emergency food and supplies. The peace process. The long-term stability of Burma and the success of the reforms hinge on national reconciliation and an end to the 65 years of armed conflict. The U.S. has provided $8.5 million for activities that bring together civil society and the government to engage effectively, to build trust among the key stakeholders, to ensure civil society and women's participation in the peace process, and to provide training and support for civilian ceasefire monitoring. Since 2012, the U.S. has provided more than $100 million to conflict-affected communities through the provision of food, education, healthcare, protection, and other life-saving services. In conclusion, we are clear-eyed about the challenges relating to these elections, the humanitarian and human rights situation in Rakhine State, and the peace process. As the events unfold over the coming months, we will reassess the context and nature of our assistance to Burma in close consultation with the State Department and Congress. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your counsel and questions.
I thank the two panelists. We understand that the election process includes the campaign, election day, and the transition to a new government, and it's not a single event. But reports as recent as yesterday have the estimates that up to 4 million citizens are unable to vote for varying reasons. That's more than 10% of the 33.5 million people officially eligible to vote I'd like to know on what will we base our assessment about whether this election is credible, transparent, and inclusive. I've heard that it will depend solely on whether the Burmese people accept the election, but I've also heard that we will make the call based on what we observe. Could you provide any clarification on that, either of you? And what are we prepared to do if the election doesn't meet our benchmarks? Mr. Russ, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're absolutely right in that the United States will call it as we see it. We will make an assessment based on the facts, and we will calibrate our response to the elections based on our assessment of how credible, how transparent, how inclusive, how free and fair we think it was. We're not wearing rose-colored glasses here. We are very mindful of the fundamental structural defects that I mentioned. There's nothing fair about reserving 25% of the legislature for the military. There's nothing fair about disenfranchising the white card holders, the Rohingyas. But Aung San Suu Kyi, the NLD, the parties have decided to contest the election on that basis, mindful of those defects. So we will we will make our assessment based on what we hear and see, based on what we are told by Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD, the other parties, the election observers. It's important to note that not only IFES, but IRI, NDI, Carter Center, EU are there in substantial numbers, as are many thousands of domestic observers. We'll listen to the Burmese media and we'll listen to the Burmese people. We'll apply these criteria, and we will also look at the morning after. It is critically important, Mr. Chairman, that all parties, including the military, accept the results of the polling and then proceed with the process of selecting a parliament and government formation, as well as the choosing of a president in a way that's fully transparent. Our ability to assist the new Burmese government, let alone to look at relaxation of sanctions or other measures, will depend on our assessment of the integrity of the overall process. Thank you.
Mr. Stivers, do you have any thoughts?
I think Assistant Secretary Russell explained it very well. There's obvious challenges with the election, structural challenges before the voting even begins. But the outcome of the contested seats are extremely important. And as we said before, there's an open and vibrant and competitive process over those seats. The challenges are daunting in terms of trying to administer election in a country with 53 million people, limited experience with campaigns and democracy, and certainly the voter lists needed a lot of work, and we've been working with our partners, IFES, to try to improve those. And I've been there with IFES in Burma to see how that's done. Realize that there's 90 political parties, over 100 different languages. You have conflicts in many of the areas where we hope voting will take place. And so the challenges of administering an election in this context is extremely difficult, and we are working with the UEC and our partners there to make it as transparent and credible as possible.
And Mr. Stivers, with the monsoon season ending, international observers and organizations expect Rohingya boat flights to resume. What preparations has the government of Burma taken in advance of this? And are other regional countries such as Thailand and Malaysia expressing concerns about the possibility of migrant boats landing on their shores? Has there been a wider ASEAN-level response to this? And how can the United States hold Burma accountable for the welfare of its own people, given that Burma does not recognize Rohingyas as Burmese citizens?
There's a lot of questions there. I'll try to get them specifically. In terms of the issue with the Rohingya and the Muslim minorities not being able to vote, that's obviously a concern and a reason why the election will fall short. And certainly we're providing assistance to the Rohingya there in Rakhine State. We're providing assistance as much as possible in some of the conflict communities, but certainly conducting an election in those areas is extremely difficult based on those realities. In terms of the flooding, we have provided a significant amount of assistance to help the most vulnerable people who've been affected. And as that moves forward, we will try to make sure that assistance continues.
Do we think that their government is prepared to deal with this, Mr. Russell?
To your earlier question, Mr. Chairman, we're working intensively with ASEAN as a group. I was in Kuala Lumpur 2 weeks ago for discussions on regional issues and raised the issue of irregular migration as the rainy season ends. We're also dealing directly with governments, in the first instance with the government of Burma, and urging them to accelerate their efforts in Rakhine State to expand access by humanitarian organizations to facilitate the peaceful return of Rohingyas and IDPs from camps to their homes, and in the meantime to protect their security and to work on creating economic opportunities. We're also working bilaterally with the concerned countries in the region, specifically Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. Secretary Kerry met with the Indonesian and the Malaysian foreign ministers over the last few weeks, and our effort there continues.
Thank you. Chairman Royce.
Thank you, Secretary Russell. So we've listed only one person on the human rights grounds on that list. I wonder why we aren't using this tool to greater effect. It just seems that the balance is out of skew, given what's at stake and given the magnitude of the human rights abuses.
Well, Mr. Chairman, we work closely with our colleagues in the Treasury Department and in the intelligence community, as well as, of course, through our embassy and our activist ambassador in Rangoon, Derek Mitchell, to try to identify bad actors, including human rights violators, and develop legally viable cases for designation. We are actively on the hunt for candidates and for evidence that will be adequate legally to list.
Let me ask you another question then, and that has to do with safe zones. Activists pushed for safe zones in Darfur and in South Sudan. That was the concept where places people could go to escape either Bashir's aerial bombardment or to escape the Janjaweed. And you have the same debate going on in Syria today. Could we create safe zones to protect civilian populations from carpet bombing? And in that case, done by Assad, by his regime. This is being suggested today in terms of Rakhine State. You've got a state here where this minority population is persecuted, and we don't have access for non-governmental organizations, for humanitarian groups that want to come in and provide services for people that are in crisis. Is this a viable option in Burma? What steps would be needed to set up that safe zone for the Rohingya inside of Burma? Those were questions I was going to ask you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's important to take as our starting point that Rakhine State, as poor and as desperate as it is not a war zone. And our strategy focuses on pushing the government of the Union of Myanmar, the government of Burma, to fulfill its responsibilities to its own people. The people in Burma deserve the full protection of the government, both at the local level and at the national level. That's what we are pushing for. The concern that I would have with safe zones per se is the risk of segregation. all people in Burma, all people in Rakhine State deserve to have their personal safety and security protected. There is, Mr. Chairman, significant dialogue now between the two communities. There is a process by which the Rohingyas in the IDP camps are being assisted in returning safely, securely to their hometowns. I believe they don't want to be segregated. They want to be integrated, and that's the direction that we are and should be pushing.
Well, here's the problem. As I talk to representatives of humanitarian organizations, of course, Doctors Without Borders was pushed out. But the argument is that that government is not doing that. It's not protecting religious minorities. So if you can have a carve-out of an area where traditionally they have lived there for generations, where the NGO community can go, that's better than state-sponsored attacks where the police look the other way. Anyway, I just wonder when they'll be reintegrated into Burmese society. Is the government there giving you some indication? And I assume you're actively pushing for integration, right?
Yes, we are. We are pushing hard for the safety of the Rohingya, the full access of humanitarian agencies, and Doctors Without Borders and some of the Margans or some of the major NGOs have been allowed to operate again.
Well, thank you. I'm out of time, but thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Mr. Sherman.
Mr. Stivers, I want to focus a little bit about your agency's financing of parts of the election. Like to know how much money we've spent supporting the efforts to develop a voter list and for temporary workers on election day and the other costs. Whether or not we think that the money we spent to help Myanmar or Burma develop the election lists has been well spent. And there's going to be 40,000, roughly 40,000 temporary workers on election day. They're paid for by foreign donors. Does that include us? And are these 40,000 going to be securing the election or intimidating the regime's opponents?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Sherman. The U.S. has provided $18 million to support the election in total, and I could get you that breakdown between what is the different things after this hearing. Those go to our partners, IRI, NDI, to work on things like party building, voter registration, some of the technical aspects of running an election through the UEC. I think that when we had this opening and when they called for an election, we believe that this was a great opportunity to support the election. There are obviously many flaws, many challenges, but we've been calling for elections for decades in Burma, and the support we provide for these technical aspects shouldn't be looked at as assistance to the government or some sort of budget support. This is democracy-building technical assistance to our partners
I'll ask you
to help the government.
From the philosophy which I support. We paid in part for these election lists. Are they good election lists? Voter lists?
The voter lists are a challenge. As I mentioned before, there's 51 million people in the country. They haven't had an election like this ever, and there's significant challenges.
Mr. Russell, you seem to have a comment?
Yeah, I was in Burma when the voter lists were first displayed, and I think the consensus among the civil society groups that I met with was that this is a significant step forward, a huge step forward, both because they were posted online and because they were posted up in the townships and the facilities. It created an opportunity for people to find mistakes.
That's good to hear. What about the 40,000 temporary workers?
So I also met with the Home Minister who is in charge of this and pushed hard for him to accept that with respect to the poll monitors and security people, while we understood the need to supplement the very sparse police force, it was important that these people not be seen as agents of the government and not intimidate potential voters. So they have now begun a training program, something that we strongly encouraged. These will be unarmed people with no police powers, and we are continuing to push for transparency by the government in explaining the rules and the roles of the poll
Have they hired party activists for the insider party, or have they hired people without a strong political view and a record of activism, or do we just not know?
In terms of the observers?
Yeah.
Where there's both domestic and international independent observers.
Well, I'm talking about the 40,000 domestic observers.
The individuals who are providing
Yeah,
security in the polls. Let me take that question
Okay,
back.
I'll ask you to come back with that because I've got another one, and this one's more difficult. The State Department has to have standards to evaluate human rights. Now, there's, as I mentioned in my opening statement, a tough line between immigration law enforcement on the one hand and ethnic cleansing on the other. I'll give you an extreme example. If the country of Romania were to expel its Hungarian minority on the theory that the Romanians have been there since the Roman Empire, and the Hungarians moved there after the fall of the Roman Empire, and apparently moved there without documents at that time, during the Middle Ages, we would call that ethnic cleansing. I assume that's clear. But if a country were to deport a man who was 80 years old, who had spent 75 years living in that country, that would be the law of many or most democracies around the world. There are a number of countries that deny birth citizenship, some who deny citizenship to those whose parents were born in the country. Do we have a standard, or is it is oppression like the Supreme Court referred to pornography? We know it when we see it. Do we have a model for what is fair treatment of ethnic minorities who have lived in countries for less than 1,000 years?
Let me speak to the specific issue of the Rohingya. Our standard is maintaining the human rights, dignity, safety of all residents in Burma. We believe that, particularly after generations of residency in Burma, that all of the Rohingyas should be given a
Mr. Russell,
pathway
if I can
to
interrupt,
full citizenship.
not all the Rohingya have lived in. There are Rohingya who are born in Bangladesh. One of them might have moved last year without documents to Myanmar, and you would draw a distinction. That's the distinction I'm asking you to draw. Obviously, everyone in the entire world, including those that we deport, should be treated with dignity. The question is, has the State Department come up with a U.S. policy on whether it is a violation of human rights to deport someone who has lived in a country for one generation, family that's lived there 2 generations, a person who's lived in a country 75 out of their 80 years? Do we have standards, or can you just, is it a matter of, obviously, to you and to me, if a Rohingya family has lived in Burma for 3 generations, it's wrong to deport them?
Well, we're not presuming to tell the Burmese precisely what standards they must apply in determining citizenship. What we are saying is that the Rohingya who live and have maintained families in Burma should be granted a pathway to citizenship that doesn't force them to self-identify against their will as Bengali.
But we apply that to those who have been there a certain amount of time, which is most of them, and we're not applying that to those who have been there for only a few years and may have moved from Bangladesh just a few years ago. And we just don't have a standard a description of what is and is not a violation of a deportation or a deprivation of full citizenship that violates human rights. We're just kind of calling it by the seat of our pants.
The focus, Mr. Congressman, is on the long-term residents of Burma.
And multi-generational.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Rohrabacher.
Thank you very much. The history of elections in Burma have been really something that is, it's been on my radar screen, but it's not been on many people's radar screen. Remember, they used to say there was a general election in Burma, and that meant all the generals got together and decided who was going to be boss. And at least we've made some progress since those days, and we're happy to hear that. And it has taken a horrendous amount of effort on the part of our State Department and other human rights people throughout the world getting behind Aung San Suu Kyi, even to achieve the progress that we've had. And now we're hopefully in the home stretch to coming to a point where Burma could foresee, and within a period of time, to have an acceptable government to basic democratic standards. But we certainly, from your testimony is that we have not crossed that line at that threshold yet. But maybe this upcoming election, if it's held correctly, will put us into a position where we have at least crossed into the line of acceptability. In the past, we have had the Karens and the Karennis and other ethnic minorities that have been oppressed. Is that oppression still going on with the Karens and the Karennis?
Well, thank you, Congressman. First, I couldn't agree with you more. The military dictatorship spent 50 years digging itself into a hole, and it's going to be an arduous process for them to climb out of it. One election isn't going to solve every problem, but we are working, and particularly our fantastic team in the field, led by our ambassador, Derek Mitchell, are working tirelessly to assist the Burmese civil society in making
through this
election.
process, I would hope that Mr. Sherman's comments about having a definition that we can actually be creating definitions as we are working through this process and see what works and what doesn't. And we will be anxiously waiting to hear what you have to tell us as this proceeds. What about in the, back to the Karens and the Karennis. Are they going to participate in this free election? And is there any indication that the repression, the level of military activities against them have decreased?
Well, the signing of the ceasefire, the national ceasefire agreement with 8 parties, represents a very big step forward. There is still fighting in some of the ethnic areas. Polling will not take place in areas where fighting is underway. But all of the groups, including the Kachin, including some of the outliers, have agreed on the text of the ceasefire agreement. Different groups have different reasons for not signing yet. What we're pushing for, Congressman, is for the military in Burma and for the government to exercise maximum restraint and to accord, even to the groups that haven't yet signed, the care that they're according to the groups that have already signed.
Well, let me just suggest that signing the document is okay. It's something we can say. Here's a benchmark, right. But it's the actual fulfilling of. I mean, someone can have a ceasefire, and from what I have sources of information from Burma say, there's still a lot of military attacks going on the Karenni and the Karens. Let me just ask this then. Okay, so we're going to hopefully there will be the fighting will go down. There will be some polling going on there. What about over there with the I guess you call them the Rohingyas, in the western side? with the Muslims from Bangladesh. We have the opposite problem there. And with the Karens and the Karenis, you have government officials and government military attacking these minority groups. But with the Muslims, what you have is the government stepping aside and watching violent acts being committed against the Muslim population there in Western Burma. So in one case, the government is too anxious to use its military against its own people, but not, on the other side, not willing to protect the human rights, basic human rights, of the Muslim population. So I hope that if there's any message that we send out from this hearing, and it is to those Muslims who are under attack, you have human rights. We care about your human rights as much as we do about the Christians who are being under attack in the Karenis and the Karen areas of Burma. And I wish you guys a lot of luck, and I know that our government, that you and the State Department are very sincere about trying to bring peace to Burma after all of these years. And I'm anxious to have a positive report a year from now about how the ceasefire and the election actually has moved forward in a way that is putting Burma on the right path.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question, I have two questions. The first one has following up about Rohingya. Has the National League for Democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi addressed the persecution of Rohingya, and would a government controlled by the opposition party, would that mean improved conditions for Rohingya?
Generally speaking, the NLD has stayed away from this issue, which is a lightning rod, a hot button issue in Burmese politics. Burma is a country with over 80% Buddhism, and the subject of Muslims, the subject of Rohingyas is very controversial. You
mean everyone's against them?
This is, regrettably, this is not an environment where any political leaders seem prepared to step up and to speak out forcefully in defense of the rights of the Muslim minority, and particularly of the Rohingya. Congressman Rohrabacher put his finger on a paradox, on a dilemma in Burma, which is that at the same time that the government and the leaders are putting a tremendous amount of effort into firming up the union by reaching ceasefire agreements and ultimately peace agreements with ethnic minorities such as the Karen and others, they are turning a blind eye to the prevalence of hate speech and divisive religious activities that will not strengthen the union, but will, in fact, divide it. Now, I was gratified when President Obama last visited Burma and stood side by side with Aung San Suu Kyi in a press conference, that she spoke out clearly in defense of religious freedom and the responsibility of a democracy to protect minorities.
Thank you. I want to ask another, since we're talking about persecuted minorities, and I want to talk about the LGBT community. I want to raise that activists in Burma have reported a high level of police abuse against LGBT persons and transgender people in particular. State Department has programs to work with law enforcement in many parts of the world to help them improve their human rights records and their criminal justice system. What I'm interested in is how can the United States government work with Burmese law enforcement and ensure that they're not targeting or abusing people because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, and also specifically, we've worked real hard to create a special envoy for LGBT rights, Randy Berry, in the State Department. Has he been able to address any of these issues? And specifically, there's the British-era law that criminalizes homosexuality, Section 317. It is still, 377. It is still on the books in Burma. Activists in Burma are working to get this antiquated law removed. What are we going to do about this? What can we do about this issue?
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal, for that question. Let me field it first, because the protection of LGBTI individuals throughout Asia is a priority at USAID, and certainly part of our overall human rights initiatives in the region. In Burma specifically, we're working with civil society organizations who are developing the skills to prevent harassment. They advocate for equal protection under the law and support activities to give LGBTI individuals greater voices in their communities. So this is part of our overall strategy in Burma.
Will we be able to get rid of Section 377, which actually outlaws, criminalizes homosexuality in Burma?
We are empowering the civil society voices who are pushing for a stronger voice and adequate human rights for the LGBT.
Well, I'm almost out of time, but I would like a report back, and I'd like, on really how that is moving forward.
I know that my colleague Tom Malinowski, when he visited Burma earlier this year, met with various groups and raised these issues. We will get you an answer.
Thank you. I'm very interested in that, and I yield back.
Without objection, I'd like to recognize Mr. Crowley for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Salmon. I appreciate your indulgence here. I served for 12 years on this committee, and I appreciate the opportunity to be back here again on an issue I have tremendous concern about, and I appreciate particularly the comments by Mr. Rohbacher, who has worked for many, many years on this as well, and particularly appreciated the comment about the general elections. It was well said. And especially in light of the fact that we look at that 25% of all the seats within the parliament, no matter what happens, will still be held by the military. In fact, you'd have to have every seat won by one party or in coalition with parties to, in essence, have any possibility of affecting change in terms of Burma's constitution. Is that right? Mr. Russell?
Well, I was in Burma recently and met with Aung San Suu Kyi, and we took out a pen and pencil and started doing the math. Yes, the opposition would have to win 66% of the seats in Parliament in order to mitigate the structural bias built in by the 25% allocation to the military. But she believes this is possible. The NLD is determined, notwithstanding the constitutional ban on her becoming the president. She said, and she said it publicly, that she sees no bar to her being able to lead and direct a government.
But you would have no problem saying right now that the cards are pretty stacked, wouldn't you?
My starting point in describing elections is to recognize the structural flaws. I would add, and I did earlier, Congressman, to that list, the disenfranchisement of the Rohingyas, the white card holders, and some of the other shortcomings.
And I appreciate the questioning by my colleague from California, but I think it's also important to point out that under Aung San Suu Kyi's leadership, the NLD voted against all 4 bills discriminating against the Rohingya population. Is that not correct, Mr. Russell or Mr.
The 4 race and religion bills which have passed, you know what, Congressman, I have to fact check how the NLD voted on all.
My understanding is they were the leaders in the opposition to that legislation. So I think it's important to point out in terms of the questioning to what degree Suu Kyi or her party have stood in terms of, this is a very sensitive issue. I recognize that, the sensitivity, but they have taken a courageous stand as a party in opposition to that discriminatory legislation. I just want to make that, and if you could get back to us for the record, but I'm just stating for the record, my understanding is they did do that. And you've talked about what you're doing to deal with the Election Day challenges, and you've acknowledged the separate structural deficiencies that we just mentioned, like the 25% of the seats controlled by the military. But you haven't said yet what you're going to do or what the United States government, through our State Department, is going to do to fix the structural differences. What are you going to do? What does the State Department plan to do to address the structural deficiencies, to address the core issues there?
Well, Congressman Crowley, the first order of business for a new government that takes office April 1st in Burma, is going to be dealing with the problems that the previous government has exported into the future. The disenfranchisement of an important segment of Burma's population, these white card holders, the Rohingyas who've been allowed to vote for before, the structural bias in terms of the 25%, the constitutional ban on Aung San Suu Kyi presidency. These are among the issues that are going to have to be dealt with first and foremost by a new government. Before we get to a new government, sir, we have to ensure that the results of the polling are honored by all parties, including the military. We have to ensure that the government formation period and that process is a fair process, a transparent process. We have to ensure also that the selection process, the election of the new president, which is done by a fairly arcane system, be a credible one as well.
Mr. Russell, do you believe we need to go back to action for action, the policy that was established during the Clinton time as Secretary of State? Do we need to go back to action for action?
Well, to the extent that we respond positively or negatively to what the Burmese do, I think that that principle has been sustained. But I do not believe that we are in a situation that warrants going back to the very basic point-for-point quid pro quo because of the momentum that has been built up in Burmese society towards reform and democracy.
Mr. Chairman, I think the President has acknowledged there's been a backsliding. I think it's a direct result as an abandonment, in my opinion, of the action for action that was effective in moving Burma forward. I am gravely concerned about not only this election process. The cards are stacked. I know that Aung San Suu Kyi and her party are putting on a great face moving forward, but they know the cards are stacked as well. I don't believe these elections will really demonstrate the true intention of the people of Burma in the result of those elections, given the fact that 25% of these seats will be held by the military no matter what. That needs to change, Mr. Russell, and I hope our State Department gets that message. Republicans and Democrats agree that that needs to change in Burma. I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I thank both of the witnesses for their time. We'll dismiss you now and seat the next panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much. We're very appreciative to be joined by a private panel this afternoon as well. The Honorable Tom Andrews appears before us as the President of United to End Genocide, and Ms. Jennifer Quigley as the President of the U.S. Campaign for Burma. Mr. Andrews, we'll begin with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee, and thank you, Congressman Crowley, for your passionate and always diligent focus on human rights in Burma. We really appreciate it. It is so important that you are holding this public hearing, Mr. Chairman, at this particular time. As you have recognized, in 2.5 weeks, the citizens of Burma will go to the polls in what the Burmese authorities are describing as democratic elections. Those who are fortunate enough to have the right to vote to cast ballots for those parliamentary seats that have not been reserved for the military or by a constitution that cannot be changed unless it is approved by the military, are grateful for the opportunity to cast their votes. But they could be forgiven for being highly skeptical of the elections that they are now facing. The last time there were national elections in Burma was 1990. Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy had an overwhelming victory, and as a result of that, they headed off either to prison, either to exile, or either to under house arrest, where they remained for decades. I was elected to Congress in 1990. I went to Congress. Aung San Suu Kyi went to prison. It was a fundamental injustice. Ladies and gentlemen, since that time, the United States began to exert systematic economic and diplomatic and political pressure on the regime. That pressure worked. 5 years ago, the military government agreed to reforms that allowed for new freedoms. Aung San Suu Kyi went from house arrest to the campaign trail and then to a seat in Parliament. I have put in my written testimony where things stand today. Many of those points were echoed by members of the committee. I'm very impressed with the fact that the level of awareness of this committee of the disturbing developments within Burma. But I want to emphasize a few major concerns. One is that the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, after sending a delegation to Burma, has concluded that Burma is at the very top of countries in the world, the single top country in which it is most likely that we will see mass atrocities and genocide in the coming weeks. Political prisoners are being newly detained in that country. At least 91 prisoners of conscience are currently in prison, while hundreds of activists await trial for their peaceful political activities. Burma continues to be designated as a country of particular concern under the International Religious Freedom Act. The movement of extreme Buddhist nationalists, the Association to Protect Race and Religion, or Mabata, is gaining strength across Burma as it relentlessly pursues a campaign fueling fear and bigotry against religious minorities. Now, you heard from the testimony today, there was a recognition of some of these problems. But there was also a good news narrative from the testimony you heard from the administration. One was that Doctors Without Borders, who the government kicked out of Rakhine State, leaving many, many thousands of people without health care. I traveled to that area when that happened. I met these people and their families. I returned 3 months later, and most of the people I met had perished because of this governmental decision. Now, the administration says Doctors Without Borders is back in Rakhine State, but what they won't tell you is that they're back under severe restrictions, that they are not allowed to provide the people with the resources that they have available to provide their health care. And so more and more people are going to continue to suffer and die because of that government restriction on people who are willing to provide health care who are not allowed to do so. As you heard, ASEAN parliamentarians for human rights came to Washington, met with Congressman Crowley and Lowenthal. They have just released a new report after sending a delegation very recently into Burma. It is in my testimony, in the written testimony. It is called Disenfranchisement and Desperation in Myanmar's Rakhine State, Drivers of a Regional Crisis. What they are saying is that the UN Refugee Agency's warning that we are likely to see a new wave of desperate people heading into rickety boats and heading into the sea, fleeing from this persecution, is likely to occur because we haven't addressed the core reasons for them leaving, and we have simply ignored the situation. And the only reason that these boats have not continued is because of the monsoon season, and the monsoon season is about to end. In 2012, President Obama made his historic visit to Burma. The president of Burma, Thein Sein, gave 11 commitments to the president for reform. The president invited him to the White House. President Thein Sein reiterated those 11 commitments. He has failed to keep all but one, including the basic right, the basic commitment for the United Nations to have human rights monitors in that country. We have not called him on this. We have not exercised the various tools that we have available to hold this government accountable and to hold those who are guilty of human rights violations accountable. It has been a systematic failure to do so. And I echo and thank Congressman Crowley for his comments, raising that question. Yes, there has been progress in some areas, but there has also been backsliding. We are going in the wrong direction, and it is incumbent upon this Congress and this administration to take action now. It's a matter of life and death for so many. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. Ms. Quigley.
Thank you, Chairman, Congressman Crowley. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak today about the challenges to democracy, human rights, and peace in Burma. A week ago today, the government of Burma touted the historic signing of a document referred to as a nationwide ceasefire agreement. It is not a nationwide ceasefire agreement. After a multi-year negotiation process, the government of Burma refused to allow 3 small ethnic armed organizations to sign the nationwide ceasefire agreement. Many of the other ethnic armed organizations were clear they would not sign a non-inclusive ceasefire agreement. Several of the largest armed ethnic organizations, including the Kachin Independence Organization, did not sign the nationwide non-inclusive ceasefire agreement. While diplomats and media converged on Naypyidaw to witness the signing of this agreement, the Burmese army launched an offensive against one of the non-signatories, the Shan State Army North, displacing more than 3,000 Shan villagers on the same day. The timing of the signing of the nationwide ceasefire was more important than the number of participants. The government of Burma pushed forcefully for a nationwide ceasefire to be signed prior to the November 8th nationwide parliamentary elections. The upcoming election is part of the current government's strategy to achieve legitimacy as a democratically elected government. The government has taken steps to limit its chances at failing to achieve its goal. The 2008 Constitution guarantees 25% of the seats to the military. With only 75% of the seats contested, the USDP only needs to win 34% of the contested seats to form a government with the backing of the military. Whereas Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy need to win 67% of the contested seats to have a simple majority and the potential to form the next government. To date, the Union Election Commission has actually canceled voting for more ethnic minorities than they canceled in the 2010 election. The Union Solidarity and Development Party government is perverting religion to garner support from a majority Buddhist electorate. The already persecuted and oppressed Rohingya minority have been stripped of their voting rights, disenfranchising approximately 1 million people. Muslim candidates have been disqualified, including U Shui Meng, a current USDP member of parliament, from the 2010 election. Parliament passed the 4 race and religion discrimination laws this year to portray the USDP as the protectors and defenders of Buddhism. The fomenting of religious discrimination and tensions raises grave concerns about election-related violence. So despite the disenfranchisement of millions of ethnic minorities, exclusions of Muslims, and disproportionate advantage for the ruling USDP party ahead of the November 8th election, the international community has an outsized expectation for an acceptable election outcome and hope for an NLD victory. But regardless of the election outcome, there are significant obstacles to establishing a truly genuine democratic government in the country. The primary obstacle is the 2008 Constitution. The military's constitution guarantees the military has veto power over any constitutional changes. To specify, what normally gets left out is that you need more than 75% of the vote in Parliament to have a constitutional change, which means every single elected member, as well as at least 1 member of the military block of seats. In addition, the Constitution states that the civilian government does not have authority over the military. It does not provide for an independent judiciary. It continues the legal authority of all military junta laws, which means that will continue the 1982 citizenship law that denies the Rohingya citizenship, as well as the law Mr. Lowenthal referred to against LGBT rights. And so those cannot be changed without constitutional change, which means the military has to prove that change. In addition, it guarantees that the military has authority over almost all ethnic minority affairs. The persecution and oppression of the Rohingya minority continues to grow dire. Earlier this year, President Thein Sein invalidated the legal status of the Rohingya identification cards, known as white cards. This has led to the Rohingya leaving Burma and taking to the sea. The United States must address both the root cause of the Rohingya's plight in Burma, as well as to continue to pressure regional governments to rescue and accept the Rohingya refugees who become stranded at sea. These deep structural and systemic problems should be the focus of U.S.-Burma relations. For too long, the Obama administration has prioritized building and deepening a relationship with the Burmese government in the hopes of persuading through diplomacy, capacity building, and investment. This approach has not worked. Nearly 3 years ago, President Thein Sein pledged 11 commitments on democracy, human rights, peace, and humanitarian need to President Obama. To date, only 1 has been fulfilled. It would be a mistake to predicate the future of U.S.-Burma policy on the signing of a partial ceasefire agreement or a deeply flawed election. Congress should consider legislation that is forward-looking to address the problems Burma will face regardless of who wins the election. Binding benchmarks for further lifting of remaining sanctions or conditions for potential future engagement have been sorely lacking from U.S.-Burma policy since investment and financial sanctions were lifted in 2012. Congress should create a legislative policy that clearly states U.S. expectations for the government of Burma on key human rights and democracy indicators as a basis for the future of U.S.-Burma relations. In my written testimony, I included a list of what they could potentially include. The Burmese military remains the biggest obstacle to achieving these key democratic and human rights concerns. Whether the USDP or NLD wins the election November 8th and forms the next government, neither will be able to address these concerns and convince the Burmese military to change its ways without the international community, and particularly the United States, conditioning the future of bilateral and multilateral relations on these key democratic and human rights concerns. A genuine democratic Burma is in the best interest of our two countries. Let's ensure Burma achieves genuine democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Just prior to you, we had a chance to hear from our administration and their policy on Burma. Mr. Andrews, what's your opinion on the U.S. government's role in Burma? How effective has the U.S. been in assisting the Rohingya humanitarian crisis, the democratic transition, the ceasefire negotiations? And what do you think the United States should do? What role should we play in the coming months?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's an excellent question. As Mr. Russell pointed out in his testimony, the administration has given voice to the concerns that he outlined. That's true. He explained that the administration is pushing for relief for the horrendous situation affecting the people in Rakhine, the Rohingya. But what he didn't specify is what specifically the administration is doing to push for these changes and these reforms. The first thing that they could do is give voice, the president could give voice, to the fact that he was personally given 11 commitments, and only one of those commitments have been, have they come through on. I mean, that was 3 years ago, Mr. Chairman, and we haven't heard anything about those 11 commitments from the administration. We can also begin to apply targeted sanctions against the individuals who are responsible for the human rights violations in that country. The administration has the authority to do so, the SDN list, but despite the fact that those human rights violations have spiked, not a single living human being has been added to that SDN list. In fact, the only discussion we seem to be hearing is about how people can get off the SDN list. The administration could also look at issues like military-to-military relations, GSP preferences. There's a whole range of things that the administration could hold out or hold off depending upon the behavior of the government of Burma, but it hasn't. I think that Congressman Crowley's call for action approach is exactly what is needed and exactly what is missing.
Thank you. Just last week, we had a number of arrests of Burmese citizens because they expressed their political opinions on social media. This is despite the fact that the Burmese government has dedicated itself to improving human rights and freedoms in the country, and despite the fact that the international community is watching this democratic transition slowly. Based on your experience with Burma, how would you assess the conditions of civil society, Ms. Quigley? Are people free to express their own political or religious thoughts? And to me, the recent four race and religion protection laws, which egregiously violates religious rights and freedom, impedes progress on this front. The law doesn't just discriminate against Muslims, but other religions as well. How do we respond, and what will the Burmese government do about this?
So civil society in Burma would say that there are, you'd call it a tale of two civil societies. Those who spread hate and Buddhist extremism and nationalism have free reign. They can hold events, rallies, protests. They can spew hate online on social media, whereas the space for those who want to show criticism or concern for the national education law or for the LGBTQ community, or those who want to speak up against the 4 race and religion discrimination laws. Those are the ones that find themselves being arrested and facing charges for violations of some of the new laws that have been put in place. And so it's sort of a tale of 2 very different civil societies and 2 very different responses. It's one of the reasons why there's been an extreme limitation of voices in the country against the persecution of the Rohingya or against these race and religion discrimination laws, because they fear death threats. There was actually a coalition of women's organizations who did publicly speak out and call on Parliament and President Thein Sein to not pass these laws, and the leaders of that have faced daily death threats as a result of doing that. And so it's a sort of a tale of 2 civil societies in Burma as a result, and it's something that our country needs to recognize and condition our relationship on a change in which you see prosecution of any hate speech that incites violence, and help to enable civil society to find more space where they're not prosecuted for exercising what here would be fundamental rights and freedoms.
Thank you. Mr. Crowley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, again for the indulgence. I really do appreciate your calling this hearing. I also want to thank and commend both Congressman Andrews and Ms. Quigley for your own personal faithful dedication to democracy in Burma. But in particular, I want to really point out the work of the U.S. campaign for Burma historically as well. Not only because of the guys sitting behind me, but because I just think you've all done such wonderful work. And Tom, you've been incredible in terms of your own personal safety. Not easy for you to travel, and yet at the same time, you've taken upon yourself to go to some of the more difficult areas to traverse in many different ways in Burma, and showed great courage in doing that. And I just want to state for the record that without regard for his own personal safety, he's done remarkable work in trying to expose the truth of what's happening to the people in the Rakhine region, the Rohingya in particular. Chairman Salmon, I think if you don't know it, you ought to know that as well. Tom, just coming back, how much of the geopolitical or the geopolitics at play at State Department plays a role, in your opinion, in terms of how they approach Burma? Moving from the action for action, in my opinion, there's almost like a race to get to Burma. Can you just maybe comment, from your opinion, in terms of the geopolitics that's going on?
Well, Congressman, thank you, first of all, very much for your comments. You know, there was a great battle here in the halls of Congress, as you recall, when those of us who believe that economic and diplomatic pressure should be exerted on the military regime of Burma.
Looking over my shoulder, seeing 3 of the portraits that I served under, one in particular who had that.
Yes, indeed. And there was enormous pressure from the business community to not exert this pressure. And there was also geopolitical concerns regarding China and the overall region and the positioning of the United States. So the good news is that we overcame those obstacles, and we demonstrated that with pressure, you can see progress. The other good news is that there are some great champions of human rights and democracy that are working within our government. I'm very, very happy and proud to say. And those voices are heard inside of the State Department and the White House. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is that the China card, the instability of the region, the location of Burma, the fact that it has such a large population, it's a very significant country. And so those voices, both of economic pressure and diplomatic pressure, remain today, and I think we have to remain ever vigilant.
And is some of that pressure coming from Europe, our allies?
Yes. There have been, in fact, it was only until the United States took the lead in exerting diplomatic and economic pressure that the Europeans followed. So there have always been those voices coming from the other side of the pond, as it were.
Ms. Quigley, how many political prisoners do you estimate are still in prison in Burma?
So I would say that there's 3 categories now as opposed to one big number. One is those who are deemed political prisoners, and that's a little over 100. Then there are those who are pending charges, who are not necessarily in prison, but facing charges, and that's another over 100 as well. And then there's the Rohingya. And it is unknown how many, if we're looking at only several hundred, or if we're looking at over 1,000 Rohingya who since 2012 have just been detained in prisons that people do not have access to, that we have no idea what their status is.
Tom, in terms of the 11 commitments the administration told us that they would hold the Burmese accountable to in terms of the government, they also said that they would release all political prisoners. In your estimate, do you believe they followed through on that?
No, they haven't. In fact, they are rearresting or arresting new political prisoners for speaking out.
And Ms. Quigley, by your statement, you would agree that they have not fulfilled that promise, have they?
Yeah, they haven't fulfilled it, and the one that seems to get lost in all of this is that they keep maintain their criminal records, and these are actually just as if they're out on parole. And so all their original sentences remain intact, and so if they step one toe out of line, they will be re-imprisoned to serve the remaining sentence from their original convictions.
Mr. Chairman, as you know, there are so many issues in regard to Burma. 5 minutes doesn't give enough time to actually really expound upon them. But in terms of the ceasefire that was entered into, Ms. Quigley, you made mention of, on its face, regardless of the fact that not every party is a party to it, can you give an assessment of your view in terms of how strong it is?
It's not very strong. I think that it left a lot of issues undealt with that they are supposed to deal with in a political dialogue process that's supposed to start within 90 days. And so I think the next 90 days will show whether or not the groups meet with the government and whether or not they will make progress on huge gaping issues. The presence of the militaries, demilitarization, all of those issues were not dealt with. And so they will have to be dealt with in the next 90 days, and time remains to be seen whether they will actually go through with that.
Thank you. I would just point out, Mr. Chairman, before I yield back the time, that irony is not lost in Burma either. And the fact that those 4 laws that were put into place to really discriminate against a particular population, the predominantly Muslim Rohingya population, basically making them a people without a country, not wanted in Bangladesh, not wanted in Burma, forced to flee because of fear of death or maybe worse in terms of being put to death, starvation and depredation and depravity. One of the ironies of this, Mr. Chairman, you might want to know, a member of Parliament of the ruling party, a member by the name of Shui Meng, who was elected as a parliamentarian, because of the change in law, his citizenship was withdrawn, was removed, and he was forced out of Parliament. And he was a part of the ruling party, which I found very ironic. There's a lot of bad things happening in Burma, whether it's the Kachin, or the Chin region, things that are going on, even with the ceasefire. This upcoming election that's taking place, and I don't want to describe my feelings as to whether they be fair or unfair. We'll let the results speak for themselves. These laws have been put in place to discriminate against the people, creating more boat people, people without a country, refugees, children, men and women, suffering and dying. I once again just want to applaud the work of both of you. And Mr. Chairman, I can't thank you enough for holding this timely hearing. It is, you don't know what you've done to help this cause. I suspect one day you will. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. The Rohingya people live both in Burma but also in Bangladesh. Some of them from Bangladesh are fleeing as well. Do they face the position of some in the Burmese government is that the Rohingya are Bangladeshis? What's the position of the Bangladeshi government toward the Rohingya? Or I realize that's literally just outside the borders of the purpose of this hearing.
Well, I mean, it's horrible the way that the Bangladeshi government treats the Rohingya, and that's actually not.
So this is a
new.
people that is persecuted on both sides of the border.
Yes.
And a people that is not only discriminated against in a predominantly non-Muslim country, they are Muslims who are discriminated against in a predominantly Muslim country.
Yes.
And The Burmese government takes the position that the discrimination is warranted because these folks are really Bangladeshis. What does the Bangladeshi government say about the Rohingya?
So they say that they are not Bengali, that they basically, in essence, are refugees from Burma. Yes, this is the position of the Bangladeshi
So
government.
the position of the Bangladeshi government is that these folks are really Burmese who have fled to Bangladesh. The position of
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
wow, and so the discrimination by the Bangladeshi government is more ethnic rather than religious. There are not
Yes.
religious differences, no doctrinal differences between one type of Islam and the other. It is purely
And they view it as an immigration issue.
how does the Burmese government treat its Christian minority?
Not well. So for years, the government has persecuted the Christians mainly because they're from the ethnic minorities. So you have sort of like the double issue of being an ethnic minority and a religious minority. It hasn't reached the level of persecution that it has faced the Rohingya, but you do have destruction of churches. You do have human rights abuses that take place against them, and sort of forced merit making, which is a process in which like they're forced to give money to build pagodas, and so it's sort of like, or if you can't afford to go pay for state schools, Buddhist schools, you don't have to pay for, and so it's more of an attempt to remove Christianity from the country than it is to persecute them on the same level of extinction that you would say for the Rohingya.
So they're, Mr. Andrews, they're taxed, and they're forced to pay for Buddhist Buddhist religious activity.
Yes, and they're literally under siege. One of the members, the delegation of MPs that came here from Southeast Asia 2 weeks ago and testified before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, was from Kachin, was Christian, and testified that in fact they are building Buddhist temples on Christian church sites.
Are they tearing down the church building?
Yes,
or?
they've destroyed the church buildings and they're replacing them with Buddhist temples. I have traveled in that part of the world. I have seen entire villages just completely vacated because of being under siege, literally under siege by the Burmese military, and seeing the refugee camps just filled with Christians who are literally under fire by this government.
Aung Suu Kyi is a hero to those who read articles about human rights. Has she or her party stood up for the Christian minority? We've talked in the first panel about the Rohingya, but has she stood up for the rights of these other minorities, ethnic and religious?
I mean, I think only through the sense of the catch-all of sort of like religious freedom and in their opposition to the four race and religion discrimination laws, most recently.
The chairman pointed out to me that you need government permission to have an interfaith marriage in Burma.
It's one of the four laws. Buddhist women need to get permission from the government to marry outside of their faith.
And the opposition party or parties supported that legislation or not?
No, the NLD was the lead in opposition to those bills and voted against them.
Will the gentleman yield for just a moment, Mr. Chairman?
I'll yield to the gentleman from
I think it's also important out that they paid a price for that. There have been tremendous protests led by extremists within the Buddhist community, Buddhist monks who have protested Suu Kyi and her party. This is an incredibly sensitive issue. There is diverse discussion within their own party about it, but I do think, don't want to make too much of it to some degree because of the sensitivity in the elections, but I think Suu Kyi has stood for principle, and I think that has to be mentioned. It may not be as vociferous as some may want it to happen to be, but she has stood and paid a penalty for that.
She has done more than others in that have power in Burma, and at the same time, because of her status around the world, we expect even more. And I yield back.
I thank the distinguished panelists for spending the time, and I thank the members up here for their interest. We've got to shine a light on this kind of thing. if it's going to be fixed, we have to get that message out and let the administration know that we're not happy with the status quo. And so I really appreciate the time. And without further objection, this meeting will now be adjourned. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Brad. Thank you very much.